Today we are happy to welcome Professor Lynn Harris, PhD. She got her PhD from the University of South Carolina. So there you go. Yeah. She's coming from the Department of History at East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. Lynn, she's a maritime historian and underwater archaeologist, and has conducted work all around the world. And she has the awesome responsibility of training graduate students to become underwater archaeologists. Jesse, if you're looking to switch, your focus for graduate work, there you go. Talk to Lynn, of course, after the presentation. But Lynn, she's a co-director of the ECU's Coastal and Marine Studies Interdisciplinary minor. She's also the chair of the North Carolina Maritime History Council and also serves on the Africa to Carolina Advisory Board. She's received numerous professional awards throughout her career, in particular for her fieldwork photographs. So we'd love to see more of those. And she is also a consultant for National Geographic's Drain the Oceans, which I know a number of you will be familiar with that show. If you haven't watched it, it's a great series. Please view those sometimes. And she is also author, along with journal articles, of Patroons and Periaguas, Enslaved Watermen and Watercraft of the Low Country. I highly recommend this book. We're looking at getting some copies in. They haven't arrived yet, but we will be getting some. But of course, you can go on Amazon or wherever, and you can find this book. So please give it a read, and also will be the topic of this evening's talk at 5:30. So if you can make it, please come back later on today. And Lynn, I'll turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
My original home is Southern Africa, so further south than the Carolinas, but now I've sort of jumped between North Carolina and South Carolina. Last time I was here was the 1980s, and I actually worked in the Comiskey, in the Rice Museum with the Browns Ferry vessel. So when I came back this time, I was totally astonished to see the Maritime Museum and the waterfront. It's like definitely on my radar for my retirement plans now. So it's a beautiful little port town. So one of my favorite topics is shipyards, combining archaeology and history. And initially, when I heard about South Carolina shipyards, when I was working here many years ago as a grad student, I was very surprised to think of South Carolina as being a big industrial area for maritime enterprise. I always had this misperception that this was all northern Philadelphia and Massachusetts. But in fact, this was relative, but one of the biggest industrial industries in South Carolina in the colonial period was shipbuilding. And two of the reasons was, of course, the resources, the timbers, live oak, and the southern yellow pine. And the other factor, the other variable, was, of course, cheap labor, enslaved labor, unhired or enslaved. So we're going to look at a couple of shipyards, and the talk intertwines various themes in history. It includes industrial history, environmental history, and then labor history. So the three shipyards, I'm going to sort of wrap these into one narrative. Hobco Shipyard in now Patriots Point, Charleston, which operated through the pre-Revolutionary era and then did some repairs in the Civil War time period. I'm going to throw in McKnight Shipyard in North Carolina, which is one of my current research focus. And then the CSSPD Shipyard, which was a Confederate inland shipyard. I'm just out of interest, does anybody know anything about these shipyards? Okay, good. Okay, so I don't want to bore you all if you know about them. But, okay, let's move on. So I'm going to start with Hobco. And the shipwrights who came to the Carolinas were fairly typical of these two gentlemen, James Stewart and John Rose. They came here, immigrated here in the 1750s. They were distantly related as cousins, and they had an uncle who provided a network for them. He was already in the Carolinas. They'd been trained in some of the best naval yards at the King's Yard in Europe, and they came here to seek their fortunes. They were artisans at that point. They didn't own shipyards, but they rapidly went up in terms of their social mobility, primarily because of the cheap labor. And they realized very quickly that either they could hire slaves, initially when they were building their wealth, train them in the shipwright skills. Later on, as they became wealthier, they would purchase slaves and hire them out. And finally, they started selling these enslaved individuals who had these skills. As the saying goes, they raised slaves by degrees. Now they're respected and well known, and they wear silk jackets and ruffles. Another interesting aspect to the whole shipbuilding and shipwright story is the role of women. And gender had not been really on my radar. I was interested as an archaeologist in the technology, very fixated on how they built ships and what sort of ships they built. But this is part of social history. So some of them, most of them arrived as single young men. Some remained single, others got married. There's also a strong possibility that, like the planters, they had enslaved mistresses. One instance is a shipwright in that area, David Lind, who bequeathed freedom to one of his enslaved females, and later on in his probate will, there's an indication that he gave regular amounts to the children of the woman. But with James Stewart and John Rose, for a while they remained single, and then John Rose met one of his neighbor's daughters, Hester Bond. He married her. This was pretty lucrative in terms of a colonial marriage, but apparently his family frowned upon it. And his partner, James Stewart, was also not very enamored of this. The reason was because they were building a shipyard, and having a family would spread these resources pretty thin. So looking at the correspondence, which was really detailed, gave you insights into the shipyard, they kept, this was a balancing act. He'd arrived there under colonial patronage with a network, expecting to make money to send it home and then to provide opportunities for other shipwrights. There's a possibility he could have married lucratively and would have helped his mobility in society, but it was also kind of a juggling act, tossing of the dice. So, moving on, I was really engaged in the story. It read like a novel. The relationship between these two shipwrights deteriorated drastically. There was squabbling, there were letters flying back and forth to home, and all of a sudden I came across this. James Stewart was found dead in the woods with a gun by his side and a piece of string attached to the trigger. So apparently this is a way of committing suicide in the colonial era, because these were really long guns. And so my thoughts were, the story's ended, and also, was this really a suicide? These guys were not having a very good relationship, with this homicide. If they had a Sherlock Holmes running around at that time, but anyway. Nevertheless, the shipyard, James Rose, then went on to become extremely wealthy, and they started building huge transatlantic ships like the Heart of Oak, and were beginning to be competitive with northern shipbuilders in Philadelphia and Massachusetts. And increasingly there were references to better built ships in the southern colonies and also better sources of lumber. During the as the Revolutionary War was approaching, Hob Court was chosen amongst the various shipyards on that river in Mount Pleasant to be the naval yard. And as testimony to the size of it, they could actually lay down 3 ships at one time, so you can see them 3 on the stocks building, which was not the usual volume of shipbuilding in South Carolina. There were also other assets in its favor. It had fresh water. There was a tidal flat, so you could careen your vessel. Another interesting tidbit was that it's far enough away from the main downtown area that the sailors and the shipwrights wouldn't go down there and get drunk and just disappear from the labor yard. So win-win situation. At this time, it really started growing and building a lot of the ships that reflected patriotic sentiment at that time in the post-revolutionary war era. And you start seeing descriptions in the South Carolina Naval Commissioner's reports about it. One very illustrious figure in South Carolina's history, Henry Lawrence, one of the founding fathers, who had plantations on the Cooper River and also in Georgetown, was a client of the Rose and Begbie shipyard, and also Pritchard, who was Irish immigrants who took it over from the Scots immigrants. And he promoted this shipyard. He also encouraged the local clientele to seek these excellent shipwrights and to be innovative in designs and to try and look at the local environment, use the local woods, and of course this really helped their business. Okay. Some of the other services of Pritchard Shipyard, not only shipbuilding, but small money-making endeavors, providing spars, yards, oakum and iron and such, finishing stocks, anchor stocks, making oars for boats and schooners, and supplying timber for damaged runners. So maintenance tasks, in addition to the usual things, and of course selling these types of maritime products. Okay, so fast forward to the present, so switching gears from the archaeology, from the history to the archaeology. This is the current location of the historic shipyard in a very residential area in Mount Pleasant. And it has a site number, 38CH 1049, which is a unique identifying number in the state database. It was also put on the National Register of Historic Places in 1974. So when a family, a local family, the Hernandez family, purchased the property with the idea of building a house, they had to consult with archaeologists to do a survey to make sure that no significant archaeological resources were impacted. And at this point, the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology, which is where I was working at the time, conducted excavations in the 1990s. And then later on, I worked with a small team of consulting archaeologists to do a further excavation based on the results. So just to give you some idea of the layout of this property in the shipyard, in 1912, the Avenue of Oaks, or Alley of Oaks, led up to the main shipyard house. This is now the entrance to the property on the road. When the Hernandez built their house in 2005, it, let's see if this works here. Yeah, there we go. It was at the other end on the waterfront, so you'd be looking to where this old house existed, which is no longer there anymore. The oaks, of course, are iconic. In South Carolina, this would lead up to the symbol of power, the plantation house. And then adjacent to the trees would be the cabins of the enslaved, also sort of a showcasing of their property. This was not the case with the shipyard. From the excavations, this wasn't the landscape model. We also know from the records that they had enslaved labor, which were actually named. These were caulkers as well as carpenters, and it gives them some identity in the plantation. And my understanding was that the Hernandez family owned it, it's still there, but they carved the names of the carpenters into the oak trees in the alley later on when they sold the property. Okay, that's the Hernandez home. Usually it's a little bit, can be a little bit sensitive, going to private property and digging holes with the potential of mitigation or telling people they can't build something somewhere because you found an archaeological property. So we were very much aware of that. This family reached out to us, very warm and welcoming, and really invested in the history of the shipyard. In fact, they came and they participated in the project themselves and in the excavations, and set up web pages and all sorts of other media outlets for this project. Just to get into some more technical aspects of archaeology, there were various stages. In the beginning, the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology did ground penetrating radar to identify the foundations of anything, structures that might have been in the shipyard. So you can see over here, all these blue lines, potentially something going on, some sort of target. And then over here was probably the most interesting, a foundation of what they believed to be a warehouse, just filled with artifacts on the waterfront. So they did, I think, move the house design slightly to preserve that, but all these artifacts were recovered and studied. Several years later, the family decided they were going to subdivide the property. It was a huge property, and put houses in this area. So what we did was we created this big grid using GIS, and then every 10 meters we dug a pit to see what sort of artifacts could be found. I was working adjuncting as a professor all over the place, Trident Tech, College of Charleston, the Citadel, and this was a wonderful opportunity to give the students some internships and service learning. So they all came out, dug holes, got out in the fresh air, used sifters to sort through the artifacts. We got really deep, and here you can see within the first 10 meters heavy deposits of materials, and eventually reaching, just to make sure we weren't impacting anything else with the construction, sea sand and then red clay. And then I'm just going to zip through these. What we do is look at densities of artifacts and classify them according to artifact types. So that was a density. One thing we noticed along the perimeter, the eastern perimeter, was lots of slag and burning. So there's something going on here at the tidal flats. And then another residential, which seemed to be a residential area with refuse and high densities of identifiable artifacts. Now the shipyard furnaces are an important feature of a shipyard. James Stewart, in his correspondences, talks about planking a 90-gun ship in the hot, wet sand, and he complained endlessly. One of the things that sort of caught my attention was that he was having to wear, they wore wigs in the shipyards in the colonial period, and he complained that they could only get bad horsehair wigs in South Carolina. And he wished he was back in Scotland. And then he said his eyes were weak, he couldn't see, they were very red, his shoes had melted several times, and he kept sending these letters back to his parents to try and send them money, and they weren't very sympathetic. So sorry for this poor guy in the furnaces, but that's probably what they were. And of course, as he moved up in his career, he no longer went into these furnaces. This is probably where the enslaved laborers conducted the work. The other thing was careening ships. So they had this ideal careening ships area where they tilted them over and they floated out platforms and then used them to work on the hull of the vessel. And then we went through the other areas where they were going to subdivide, looking at artifact type densities, counted the ceramics, the glassware, the slag, and eventually came up with some idea that there was another structure or else occupation or work area between those tidal flats and furnaces. And we couldn't quite figure it out. We didn't go in and do anything in depth, but it was possibly a kitchen, a taverna, a laborer's quarters, or slave quarters in that area. And essentially the houses they put up did not impact this because they moved the design slightly. And then we went through each of those categories and tried to determine what could have happened there. Okay, so this was the layout ultimately from the archaeological work. We had the main house, the storage facility which Skia excavated, a refuse area that could also have been a tavern or the quarters of the enslaved, close to the industrial area and the tidal wharf. So contrasting this to the usual plantation layout. Some of the more interesting artifacts we found were glass tools. These were bottle bases or necks which were modified. Sometimes they look like formal tools, and it's a strong possibility these were used for scoring wood, for cutting lines, for cutting sails. We do know that they were quite prevalently found in plantations near the African American quarters, and were frequently used for sanding or shaving the handles of hoes or rakes or wooden agricultural tools. We have a more formal one, which is later, and is a possibility these were not just African American, but adopted by the Scottish and the other shipwrights as well, or laborers, simply because it was cheaper instead of buying knives, you could sharpen up and learn how to make a glass tool. Diet. They were eating deer, cow, pigs, fairly young animals. The molars did not appear to be worn down at all. And then, interestingly to us, birds, all sorts of tiny little birds. I can't imagine getting the meat off a songbird, an egret, just water birds that were out there that were part of their diet. And then cut bones indicating that this wasn't just natural, these were part of a feed strategy or a diet. Okay, any questions about Pritchett? I'm going to move on. Okay, so McKnight Shipyard is in North Carolina, and he, like the two immigrant shipwrights, was also Scottish, and similarly became very wealthy. He was a merchant, and he, in contrast to Pritchett, who was a patriot, he was a loyalist, and he lost his entire shipyard. So the loyalist claims are what clue us into some of the workings of this shipwright. He also had other enterprises going on in addition to the shipyard, things like a sawmill, a shingle producer. So this was a business that also radiated out into that local North Carolina community. This is I don't know if you can see this in this lighting, but it's right up here, the northern part of North Carolina in Currituck. It's a creek called North River, and there's also a location named Indiantown. He apparently had a lot of transactions and dealings with Native Americans as well, which is an interesting part of the story. That's where his shipyard was. So it was in North Carolina. This is, one of the most convenient and largest shipyards. Okay, in the 1980s, a local couple, Henry and Wilson Snowden, found some wharfs when the tide was very low, as well as a shipwreck, and they invited the North Carolina underwater archaeologists, the equivalent of your South Carolina team, to come and look at these underwater sites. And they found a shipwreck, which they recorded and became part of a thesis for a student. They found buttons dating to that time period of various kinds. And then, as you can imagine, in a river, there's a lot of tumbling around of artifacts and layers of time periods. They found these large demijohns and mason jars, which were more like early 1900s. Anybody have any ideas what they might have been?
Something to do with alcohol.
Yeah, exactly. So this is alcohol. In this area of North Carolina, there was a lot of bootlegging going on and moonshine stills in that area. And they would put these mason jars and demijohns in a net behind the boat and tow them up and down the river, which was illegal. And if they thought they would get caught, they would just snap that rope, cut that rope off, and these mason jars and demijohns would litter the bottom of the river. So this is kind of a layer of later time period material culture on top of this Revolutionary shipyard. And we have not been able, I really want to go back and study, that's one of my next interests, is bootlegging in North Carolina and moonshine. Apparently it was rampant on our coast. I don't know about South Carolina, but it's North Carolina. They found some shoes, testimony to the good preservation in this fairly dynamic river environment. And then lastly, getting into the history and trying to combine the history and the archaeology is looking at what Thomas McKnight lost or had to give back. And they make this very distinctive statement that he had these African tradesmen who were skilled in the making of shipwrights, and then the sentence, they were able to build a ship within themselves, by themselves, with no assistance other than a master builder, so somebody giving them instruction. So you can imagine they had these skills which were now transferable. If they become freed enslaved individuals, they could go out into the community and it would give them agency and competition. All right, so this is one of my favorite. I had moved from South Carolina to get employment in North Carolina, and no sooner had I done that when we were invited back by South Carolina, Jim Spirek, to do a project on the Great Pedee River near Florence, on the CSS, the Confederate Navy Yard, which was on the banks of the river. And this was the site for constructing this wooden gunboat, CSS Pedee, built in 1864, but then sunk fairly soon afterwards to avoid capture by the Union troops. And so this is our field school crowd. I think we had about 20 ECU students. I don't know if any of you know our state underwater archaeologists here in South Carolina. Carl Naylor and Joe Beatty, and then our famous maritime historian, Larry Babbitts, who's a military maritime historian. So we got together and the objective was to find the cannons on the boat, find the vessel, and also do research on the shipyard itself. So just a geographic orientation, that's Hub Core Shipyard down south at Charleston. Here's Mars Bluff Shipyard. Also has a distinctive number, 38 MA 2291, also an archaeological site. Okay, so this is the CSS Pedee, a Macon-class gunboat with a shallow draft. It was around, I think, 170 feet, 26 feet of beam, and speed was around 10 knots. It was wooden, and it had a combination of steam engines, a propeller, and then a mast. It also had two Brooke rifled, it wasn't heavily armed, two Brooke rifled cannons, and then a captured Union Dahlgren. Now there's a very interesting serendipitous story about this Dahlgren, is that Jim Spirek, who was the principal investigator on this project, had also done his master's thesis at East Carolina University. This is a whole network here on another vessel called the USS Southfield that was sunk by the CSS Albemarle in North Carolina. Well, once we started bringing these cannons up and studying them, we found the serial number on the trunnion, or not on the trunnion, but somewhere on the Dahlgren on the CSS Pedee, and discovered that that vessel he'd done his master's thesis on had been the one they'd captured and taken the gun and put it on this one. So he couldn't believe it. He kept saying, "No, this surely isn't. There's something going on here. You know, the ghosts of the Confederacy here somewhere in action." Now the Navy Yard was also, interestingly, it was under the command of Edward Means. A lot of the Confederate sailors and soldiers were off fighting for the cause, and the shipyard became kind of a social gathering place in that area. And so looking at the Marion Star, this is 1913 when Edward Means died, and there was a small obituary which was really peculiar but kind of interesting too. It said the Navy Yard was a kind of a picnic. It was where the wild waves go for the young girls and the older men from Marion and Bennetville. So this seemed to be a place where you went to, socialize, to meet people. I'm sure the young women are also pleased to meet the wild waves. And we hear about them having parties on the boat as it was being built. So they would have a fiddler, they would dance on the boat until one night it became so hectic that they actually had to expand into the shipyard. So this was the hub of social life during that time period. Another aspect of the women's role in the shipyard is that the Confederate women felt very invested in the Confederate cause and building the ship. They described how the Confederacy was running out of money and they needed to help them by selling their jewelry, their diamonds. There were numerous events, bazaars, and other types of activities to raise money, and they claimed that the PD was their boat. You also see correspondences about the enslaved laborers who were going into the swamps to gather wood to build the boat, and they would write complaints to relatives saying, we don't have enough money to provide shoes for the laborers. They're going in to get the supplies for the boats, and we please need funds so we can look after the enslaved laborers properly. They were now in charge of this industrial enterprise. Moving to the archaeology, this is an old plat of the shipyard. You can't really see much, but we had both terrestrial and underwater excavations going on. This red patch there is the area we did underwater work. We had a fieldwork shelter for the students to work under and sort the artifacts and the ordnance. And then we had the property owners who were still living there in a mobile house. So it's kind of like, we thought we were living on somebody's property, much like the Hofcore project. So what we did was we had a datum, a control point up on the riverbank, and then we had lines going underwater that the students would search along to find artifacts that may have been submerged. We were also looking for the cannons. So we found the cannons, the Dahlgren and the Brooke rifle, and then we set up what we called search lines, A, B, C, D, E, F, and we would deploy 2 divers along each search line, and this was zero visibility, raging current, swim upstream into the against the current, and then surface and go back down what we call the main highway. This looks very organized. It was total chaos for the first 3 days with people bumping into each other and getting lost and being washed downstream. But we ended up getting it right towards the end. We had some divers mapping and photographing and measuring the cannons, and then the others swimming up and down looking for artifacts associated with the shipyard. And then we set up little buoys to mark them, and divers went down, brought them up. We used a dredge, which is like a big underwater vacuum cleaner, to suck them up into this floating contraption, and then we would sort them out and try to make sense of what we were finding and how it related to the shipyard. At this time, we did not recover any cannons. This was conducted later on by SCIA, but they pulled all 3 of those cannons out, and I believe they're in the Warren Lash Conservation Lab at the moment with Hunley. Not updated on that. Terrestrial pits, the on-land aspect of it, again similar to Hopcore. We dug holes all over this place and then try to put them back. Interestingly, we found high numbers of Native American artifacts, stone tools, ceramics. So this shipyard, which was very temporary in nature, had been built over previously a Native American settlement, which is deserted at that time. That was interesting. Ceramics dated to that time period included Johnson Brothers of Hanley, founded in 1883. These were some of the most popular types of dinnerwares during that time period that were being sold out of New York and Philadelphia, so had made their way down to this shipyard. One of the most iconic artifacts in the underwater context as well as on land were caulking tools. So these were used to clean out the seam of a boat between the planks before you made it watertight by pushing in cordage and then tarring it with pitch. Most of the workers during the 1800s were African Americans, both freed and enslaved. They had quite a lot of power. There's an indication that in some of the major port cities, they would strike for better pay. They had unions, and there was also a form of activism. They would go into shipyards and sabotage boats if they didn't feel they were getting paid correctly. In retaliation, this set in motion a series of protests by white shipyard workers who felt their jobs were being taken by the African Americans. And it's very similar to the post-Revolutionary War period, where there were similar protests by immigrant white shipwrights coming into South Carolina who saw that the enslaved shipwrights who now had the training were taking their job niche. So I think this is a very interesting tool here. There's a story behind it. Had different types of caulking tools, and combining the historical with the archaeological record, you can see the variation depending on specialized caulking jobs on the ship itself. Another if anybody knows what a friction primer is, anybody interested in ordnance, I had no idea. I was swimming along a search line with a student, and she picked up this thing, and I thought, no, that's a twig, and I told her, just throw it down, and then I felt it, no, this is not a twig, it's something metal. So we put it in our bag, carefully put it in our little Ziploc bag, and brought it up, and the moment Larry Babbitts, who's the military aficionado, saw it, he went ballistic, and he said, this is a friction primer. This little twig-like object was used by the Navy to ignite cannons made charge. It was this very specialized instrument. It turned out that he'd never seen anything used like this by either the Army or the Navy, and he thinks it was marketed by the Confederacy or brought in by the blockade. But he did an entire article, maybe 3, on friction primers after that. Brook shells, this is, we brought them up, much to the horror of our dive safety officers who thought they were going to explode. So we made our chief, Christopher Amer, bring it up, and then Larry Babbitts proceeded to prod and hammer on these things. We all steered well clear, but he does know what he's doing, we hoped. Testimony to the social aspect of the yard, we have all sorts of commercial beauty products for both men and women. This is cocaine hair oil. This isn't cocaine, it's actually kind of a cocoa substance that was used to, sold by apothecaries to make your hair thick and voluminous. I guess if you were having this, a wild way of having a picnic in the shipyard. We also found women's hairpins. I don't have anything on that. Kaolin pipe stems, they're WG, so these were all within time period of the shipyard. Native American artifacts, Yadkin points, dated from 3000 BC to 800 AD, so this is the other layer of occupation prior to the shipyard. And then log docks, these were eye bolts used to put into logs which were rafted up the river with a chain, and then the log docks would be pulled out and you'd have your lumber for your shipbuilding industry. But these were also all over the river bottom. Another surprise was when we reached out to the local community, we wanted to know if people had seen the shipwreck, if anything had been recovered, if anybody knew if had relatives there, they were descended from somebody who worked in the shipyard. And this gentleman, Randy McAllister, came forward. His great-great-grandfather, Virgil Verge, had been part of the Confederate initiative. He had been the shoemaker, the saddle maker, and a carpenter. And he'd been felt very much part of the Confederate military. When I said, I was surprised by African Americans being part of the Confederacy, he said, no, hang on, I'm not exclusively African American. I also have Native American relatives, so I am Native American, African American. And so that's, just a small insight into the story that I think needs to be investigated. We know, of course, there is a lot of Native American presence in this area. Okay, so looking at the landscape after we had analyzed our data just briefly, you can see here the sand pits for kiln work, similar to the furnaces on the colonial shipyards. This is our survey area with the big black block, and then down below you can see the dike dock. From what we can understand in the historical records, they had a large depression or pond that they built, and they would construct the vessel in that pond, in that depression, and then dig a dike and fill it with water so they could float it out. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at landscape features from an aerial perspective. That were part of how they operated this yard. But nothing like foundations. This was a simple affair. It was supposed to be a secret yard, so they probably had temporary wooden structures up that completely were lost. We did see the railway tracks though, where they were bringing supplies in. That was fairly evident. It's not on that map. Okay, so just to conclude, these 3 shipyards give us insight into the range of activities that took place in South Carolina and North Carolina. Again, all very dependent on enslaved labor. Women played a role, as well as industrial activities that were promoted by fairly wealthy businessmen and important prominent people in the community to elevate this industry in South Carolina. Now, this signage here is dedicated to the scuttling of the CSSPD and the Confederate cause. But at the bottom you see a saying, "No nation rose so white and fair, none fell so pure of crime." It's also a testimony to the invisibility of the African Americans, the carpenters, the saddlers, the shoemakers, who played a role in these shipyards. So that's part of the narrative that at least I and some of my colleagues are trying to tweak out, is who else other than the captains and the head shipwrights played a role in making these shipbuilding enterprises come together and so successful in South Carolina and North Carolina. There are all sorts of readings on this. This is a full-scale 200-page report with every little archaeological detail you could want. It's free, it's online. I wrote an article for the Journal of Maritime Archaeology, which is easier reading. That's out there as well. And then this was a team effort. There were so many collaborators, local community, the property owners, funding by the Bruce Lee Foundation of South Carolina for the project. And then, of course, all the students who came out there and braved this really dark, violent water with us, but learned a lot. So, and they're all out there now working as underwater archaeologists elsewhere. This was 2009, so they're now all most of them gainfully employed around US and abroad. So thank you all, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer.
Thank you, Lynn.